Welcome back, everybody, to another awesome chapter in our family communication saga. We are back today with chapter 8 and a topic that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, very, very familiar with, communicating under stress, right? We all experience stress, but really what this chapter does is it helps us understand both theoretical and practical perspectives on stress. We're going to learn about what stress really is, how it affects families, where it comes from. We're going to look at different models of studying stress, and these models are there to actually help us break apart stress and pinpoint a couple of key factors in the stress we are experiencing in our families so that we actually can apply actionable strategies to mitigate the impact of this stress on both ourselves internally and our families as well. So let's go right ahead and get into it. You know that with every single chapter, what we do is we start off by defining the term that we're working with. There is nothing different about today, so we are going to talk about what stress really is. And of course, you all know what stress is. You no doubt experience it. You're probably experiencing it right now as we're kind of coming toward the end part of the semester. And so what we're going to do first is understand what family stress is specifically, because that's the focal point of our class. So family stress is inevitable, meaning that it's going to happen no matter what. So our goal as family scholars and communicators is not necessarily to try to stop it, but really to understand where it comes from and how to resolve it and manage it when it does show up. And so that's the first thing we have to know about the definition of stress out the gate. It's not something that we can always prevent all the time. Sure, there are things we can do in our lives to help reduce stress. So for example, as a student, you might have a planner and plan out your week, and that will reduce your level of stress because throughout the week, you will have a better idea of what you should and should not be doing as you go through your week, and you have better command of your schedule. However, that doesn't mean that you will experience no stress ever during that week. You'll probably be stressed for a variety of other reasons, or you might still feel stress because of your schoolwork, even though it's at a lower rate. So really what this first bullet point and what your textbook and I want you to remember is that it's inevitable. It's something that is going to happen. And so none of the strategies that I will teach you today have anything to do with trying to stop it. It's really about recognizing it when it occurs in families and what we should do once it does occur in families. So, stress then is a normal part of family life and I think everyday life, right? And one of the things we have to remember is that the dialectical perspective that we learned way, way back in chapter 2 when we looked at different forms of different perspectives on research and theory, we learned about the dialectics. And one of the things that they remind us of is that life is full of these kind of tugs and pulls between different tensions. And if you look at stress from that perspective, it reminds us then that change occurs as growth occurs. And whenever there is growth, there's always stress because growth is not always a wonderful, painless experience. Growth is often sometimes a very painful experience. And so it's important to remember that stress can be positive as well, even though we think of it in very negative ways. It's all about how we manage the stress that makes it positive or negative, not necessarily the stress itself. And that's why I have those words in bold right there at the very end so that you can see the ways in which stress can be made positive or negative by the way family members communicate with one another. And so to start off the conversation, I have an example from Modern Family. This video is called Dumpathy because it features Phil Dunphy trying to learn how to manage his wife's stress through active listening strategies and providing empathy for her. And I think this video does a great job of tying in a lot of the other themes that we have talked about previous to this chapter in here. So in addition to managing her stress, he's using active communication strategies that we learned from our previous chapter 7 on conflict and violence in the family, and he's recognizing and adapting to the different needs that she has throughout the day in order to ensure that he's helping to reduce her stress and showing her that he supports her. So I recommend that you give this a watch, and it kind of gets us into a really good foundation for the rest of our lecture. So now let's talk about key terms, what stress is and what a stressor is. So now that we know about the different types and factors with stress, again, I'm sorry, here comes my dog just barging in through the door. My house is not haunted, I promise. As we are learning about stress and stressors, one of the first things we need to know is what is stress really? And so, of course, I'm sure all of you could define it for me, but your textbook provides you this definition. Stress is the stimuli producing stress reactions, the reactions themselves, and the various intervening processes. And this is an incredibly important, albeit very dry definition, because what it does is that it reminds us of three major things. It reminds us that stress comes from some sort of stimuli, right? It comes from something. Something is making us stressed out. That something could be us. That something could be an event. That something could be an event that makes us stress out, and then we stress ourselves out more. It could be any sort of stimuli that is causing this reaction of stress in us. Which is the second portion of that definition, the reactions themselves, and then the various intervening processes. Intervening processes is just a very fancy phrase for us to say, this is how we respond to the stress, right? And again, those responses can be positive or negative. It can also refer, of course, to how other people try to help us manage our stress as well. Then we have our stressors, and our stressors are the resulting behaviors from the events which cause the feelings of stress. So a stressor, basically in layman's terms, is anything that gives you stress, right? And so one key thing that we've actually found in a lot of family research is that a big stressor for married couples or couples living together, sharing a residence, is finances. And so an example that I have for you here is from The Pursuit of Happiness. It's a movie. And in this particular clip, this husband and wife are discussing finances, and you can really hear it laced throughout the wife's communication the entire time, because she seems very, very much focused on the bills that are late, how late they're due on their mortgage, and all the other issues surrounding money. And so here in this example, money and finances are her stressor, right? Are the cause of the stress that she is feeling. So now that we understand those key terms, let's move into understanding different models of stress. And the first one that I think is actually a really easy way of looking at stress is the AB-X model. I'm going to call it just the ABX model for now. And the reason for why it's important is because it helps us piece out and parcel out different portions of the stress that we are feeling or that our family is feeling, so that we can better understand it. So before I go through this, I want to discuss a little bit about why the ABCX model is helpful on a practical level. So on a practical level, it's helpful because it pieces things out. It helps us to understand and make a little bit more sense of possibly a very emotionally draining time. Whenever you're feeling stressed, you join the rest of the world, including me, in feeling overwhelmed, right? Feeling emotionally stressed out, feeling mentally stressed out. All stress does is it makes you feel overwhelmed, and that feeling of being overwhelmed makes it quite hard for us to think critically about decisions that we need to make, or what path we need to take, or what action we need to do next in our lives. And so the ABCX model helps us as a tool to kind of wade through these murky stress waters and really pinpoint some of the key issues about what's going on in our lives, so that we can be more empowered to actually manage and mitigate the impact of stress. So the ABCX model says that if you are feeling stressed, one of the first things you can do for you and your family is breaking down your stress with A, B, C, and X. So A is the stressor. Identify the stressor. What is it? Is it finances? Is it school? Is it conflict within the family? Is it growth? What is it? What is the cause of stress? B is your family's resources and strengths for coping with the stress, the change that is happening, right? So for example, if someone in your family is very ill and is experiencing very difficult times health-wise, that would be A, your stressor, right? Your stressor in that situation would be their not good health, right? They're not good health then would require us to look at B, which is, do we have the resources or the strength to cope with this change of this person not having good health? And one of those things that we would actually look at is the family able to have healthy communication about the stressor? Can they actually talk about it? Do they have the resources to be able to do that? The skills to be able to do that? Do they have strengths of facilitation, right? Do they have emotional intelligence? Do they have the conflict mitigating strategies that we learned from chapter 7? We would look at all of those to see what tools or resources does this family have at their disposal. The C that we would look at is the perception that the family has. And we learned this in chapter 7, that sometimes perception is everything. So in chapter 7, we talked about conflict, and the textbook and I both reminded you that the conflict doesn't necessarily have to be quote unquote real in order for it to impact families. Two people could perceive that they have a conflict, and the conflict is very real to them. And the same concept goes for here. So you might not actually be experiencing stress, or something might actually be quite easily fixable in your life, but if your family perceives it as a source of stress, or you perceive it as a source of stress, it's very real to you because your perception has made it now part of your actual lived reality. One example of that is, I'm sure many of you could self-reflect on a time when you were heavily stressed out over a homework assignment, right? Maybe you thought, I'm going to fail, I'm not going to do well, or this assignment is too difficult. And then afterwards at the end, you get a pretty good grade and you're like, why did I stress over that? Why was that such a big deal to me at the time? Because now that I look back, yeah, that assignment was pretty easy for me and I did really well. And so that's an example of how perceptually something can make you stressed out when in reality, maybe you had the skills and ability to do the homework the whole time. You just felt that you couldn't. So that perception caused you stress. So that's very key to remember, because even if sometimes a stressor is not based in reality, but is based in your perception, it still causes the same consequences that all stress does, okay? And then X would be the last thing that we look at, which is the degree to which the family system experiencing feelings of stress or discomfort. Some things might cause very high levels of stress. Some things cause very low levels of stress. And remember that depending on your family's configuration, their cultural background, and the different macro and micro subsystems that they live in, all of that impacts whether or not they see certain events or stressors in their life as high levels of stress, medium levels, or low levels of stress, right? One personal example you can think of on yourself is maybe you might be stressed out at work, but actually find school not very stressful at all, or vice versa, right? But someone else might think school is super stressful and work is super easy. So this is just a reminder that not all families are the same, and so they experience stress differently. So two families could both be going through the same thing. So for example, they might be both going through financial difficulties. One family will definitely experience that and deal with that in a different way, okay? So now let's discuss different types of stress. So now that we've learned a little bit more about the definitions of them and we've learned how stress plays out, let's look at different kinds. So we're going to look at developmental and unpredictable. And so here, your textbook also refers to them as normative or non-normative. I'm just going to refer to them as developmental or unpredictable just to keep it easier and clean, but I put it here in my slides for that clarification. So the first type is developmental, and these are the naturally occurring part of the human developed process related stress. So this is birth, death, marriage, retirement. All of these things are natural parts of us all growing up and getting older, our children growing up and getting older, children being born, people passing away. These are all stressors that are naturally going to happen, so they're part of that developmental process, and we categorize them in developmental stress. Unpredictable stress is anything outside of that developmental timeline, so things that you absolutely did not plan on or that you didn't plan on happening or you could not foresee. So for example, things like losing a home, winning the lottery, getting injured, getting an illness, anything like that. Those are things that you can't predict or foresee, and they are under the category of unpredictable stressors, okay? These stressors often intertwine, so often it's difficult to distinguish between them. So if you're having a really hard time, shoot me a message and I'm happy to clarify for you, especially as you're working on your journals and your projects and you're kind of iffy between two and you're not sure which ones to define. Let me know and I'll be more than happy to clarify for you. So for example, death at times can be developmental and predictable. So for example, let's say that you have grandparents that are getting on in age and you know that they're not doing great health-wise. The family may actually prepare themselves emotionally and be ready for that person to pass on. However, someone could actually die unpredictably, right? At a very young age, very suddenly, and you don't expect that to happen. And so even death, as an example, can fall sometimes in the unpredictable category just as much as it can fall in the developmental category. Again, if you have any questions, always shoot me a message. That's what I'm here for. So moving on. Now I'm stressed out about this, y'all. Come on, Prezi. Okay, so we talked about this. Now let's move on to contextual models of family stress. So now we looked at the ABCX model. We looked at different types of stress and helping to identify whether or not they were unpredictable, part of the developmental process. And now we're going to look at the context of stress. And so I want to preface this discussion by saying that the contextual model of family stress is a little chunky to get through. It's a lot of information. So this is the first slide for it. And then I have 2 more slides after this. And I've labeled them as such. So you can go back and review them for the contextual model if you need to. But I just didn't want you to get confused. In introducing you to the contextual model of family stressors, what this model does is it tries to take into account the context of what's happening to the family in relationship to the stress that they are experiencing. So we would look at 2 different types of context. We would look at the internal context and we would look at the external context. So the internal context is based in the family's perception of events, not the stressors themselves. And then the external context focuses on their response to the stressors as they have learned to respond through different social and cultural standards and norms, okay? And so I'm going to give you examples of both internal and external stressors in the next slide. Real quick before I do that, I have a little infographic video here on what happens to you when you actually do get stressed. I really recommend that you watch it. It's not very long and I think it's very informative and gets right to the point about how stress not only affects you cognitively and emotionally, it can also affect you physically as well. People, for example, can actually get sick, right, from being stressed. So watch this so you can kind of be self-aware about what stress is doing to you, so that when you are more self-aware, you're able to mitigate and manage stressful conversations with other people in your family. All right, so now we're going to continue on with our conversation about contextual models of family stressors. I'm going to start with providing an example of external context, as we talked about. So external contexts are part of 5 key frameworks. So the historical, economic, developmental, hereditary, and cultural frames. And so as we said before, this model really tries to take into account context, and external context involves things such as the historical frame. So you can see here that the historical frame is important to recognize because the point of the family's history in which the family experiences the stressor is important. So if you're a young growing family, right, so if it involves 2 parents that just had a child, that's a very different context than a family that has 3 children that are mostly grown and have more experience together as a family, right? So the point in which it happens in family history matters. The economic frame is another external context that we look at, and this is really the economic conditions that the family has to be beholden to. Oftentimes, families have to deal with the cards that they are dealt, right? So at times, parents get laid off, or the economy is not doing so well, or the economy is doing very well, and all of those things impact externally how the family does. And as I've said before, finances tends to be the one of the top, if not the top, stressor in most families. And so the economic frame is important to look at because it helps us recognize where a major source of stress is coming from. The developmental frame takes into account the stage in family life when a stressor is experienced. Unlike the historical frame, which would also take into account generation, right, intergenerational relationships, the developmental frame takes into account just that macro system and what that family is experiencing in their current developmental state. Hereditary, this reviews this idea that we, get genetics from our parents, right, biological genes that either help us that contribute to our ability to deal with stressors, right? For example, health is a big factor in how families react to their stressors. So if you are dealing with lots of financial stress and then you also have a family member that is ill, that just compounds upon it. So the hereditary frame reminds us that the biological good health that we might get from our previous ancestors does actually impact our ability to respond to other stressors that we have today. So for example, you'll find in my family, the likelihood of having breast cancer is something that is passed down. And so that is a source of stress for me because I have to worry about that with my mother, and then I'm going to have to worry about it myself. And if I have a daughter, that's something that I'll have to worry about with her, right? And that'll be something that we have to be much more vigilant about when we are taking care of our health and doing checkups and all of that kind of stuff, right? And there's a multitude of different hereditary genetic traits that get passed down between families. And so it's very interesting to kind of look at those patterns, and your textbook does a great job of providing multiple examples of that. Cultural frame takes into account the values of the culture, which in turn then impacts how the family views the stressor, right? So if you are from a collectivist culture, for example, you view conflict as not desirable. So if you have a stressor in your life, your collectivist culture will most likely make you view the stressor as something that needs to be managed and dealt with as a group, because the group needs to manage it together in order to avoid conflict. If you are from an individualist culture, you might view stressors in a more personalized way. You might self-reflect a little bit more on how the stress is specifically impacting you. And that will then impact your communication about the stress, because when you talk about it with your family, you are most likely going to focus on how this stress has impacted you, whereas a collectivist culture might be focusing on how the stress impacts the group as a whole. Sound good? So now we're going to look at the internal side of it. Internal context is also known as relational culture, and this is just a fancy phrase for how people relate to each other in a family. Remember that all families are different, and so some families are very verbally active, some are not. Some families are very much into spending a lot of time with each other, have more nonverbal immediacy with each other. Other families are not. And so it's important to remember that the stories, myths, themes, rituals, metaphors, conversations that we have with our family on a regular basis will always impact how we deal with stress. And if those at all sound familiar concepts to you, we've talked about them in chapters 6 and 7 when we talked about family stories and conflict. A couple of these internal factors are important to look at. So the first kind of internal internal context that we'll look at is family size and structure. Big families operate on a completely different level than smaller families, right? So at a very baseline level example I can give you is a child, for example, that has a two-parent family home experiences stress and learns to deal with stress very differently than a single parent family home. When you have a smaller family size like that, where you only have one parent instead of two, usually all the stress, all the responsibilities get poured onto that one single parent, and so they have to manage and deal with that stress a lot more, and we typically actually see that spill out onto older siblings as well, right? It's quite interesting. And so it's important to remember that how big your family is and how it's structured, whether or not it's very high power distance where, for example, elder elder family members don't talk or relate a lot to younger family members, or whether or not it's more inclusive, where we see lots of interaction between different family members. All of that will impact how they deal with the stress, because how you normally communicate with people really impacts how you communicate with them during stressed times. So another one is also personality and cognitive functions of family members, right? Some people have super A-type personalities and they just want to get out there and talk about their stress and manage it head on. Some people are not like that and manage stress differently. And so if we have competing personalities in families, that can be quite difficult to manage. And so it's important to take into account that context as well. And then we have also cognitive functions, right? Children, for example, sometimes depending on where they are developmentally, do not have the cognitive function to remember certain, to understand certain very complex things, right? So if a child witnesses their parents getting divorced, depending on the age that they're at, they might respond to that stressor differently because of their ability to understand what's going on, right? So it's very important. One more modern example I can give you from an external factor is the issue of family separation. We've talked about it a little bit in the past chapters of this course, but one of the things we have to remember is that the younger children who were separated from their families at the border experienced great trauma as a result of it. And there was a clip a little bit different from the one I showed you, where a young boy was telling his mother after they were reunited that she doesn't love him and that he doesn't believe that he loves her, because if she loved him, why would she leave him there alone, right? And obviously she did not choose to leave him there alone, but because he's so young, he doesn't yet have that full cognitive ability to kind of wrap his mind around this very complex immigration system that we have, right? Even adults can't really wrap our minds around this very complex system. So it's important to think about where people are cognitively in their development and whether or not they can actually understand a lot of the complex things that are going on in their family externally. Previous life experiences, right, from family members. So we externally get influenced by what we're taught from other family members and what is expected from other family members as well, right? A lot of my girlfriends, for example, recently got married, and they are experiencing high levels of stress to try to get pregnant, because that is something that other family members expect of them. Previous family members of theirs got pregnant almost immediately, right away after they got married. And so my girlfriends are feeling a lot of external stress from their extended family and from other generations that went before them, because now they feel they have to do the same. Family perceptions of the magnitude of the stress, as we talked about, very similar to the ABCX model. This would be the X in the model, right? So how family members perceive the magnitude of the level of the stress or the seriousness of the stress impacts how they deal with it as well. And then, of course, boundaries, rules, patterns of interactions, and available resources. If this at all sounds familiar to you, it should, because we talked extensively in our first unit about boundaries, rules, roles, role allocation, how people interact with each other in a family, and how that impacts their relationships with one another. And remember that dealing with stress is a deep relational bond, right? If you have a good relationship with someone, you are more likely to successfully deal with stress with them than someone with whom maybe you don't have as good of a relationship, right? And so that's why I put kind of a little asterisk note here for you to remember that family internal and external contexts relate and impact each other, as a family's relational culture is impacted by external context. What that means is that I know that I just showed you one slide on external context and one slide on internal context. These intertwine, right? Just as we talked about the developmental versus the unexpected types of stress and how they intertwine, these intertwine as well. So I put them on different slides so that you can have a little bit of a better understanding. However, don't take them separately from each other. Look at the model as a whole and see how these impact one another, right? So like I said, let me give you an example. We just talked about external factors, right? One of them being the economic frame, how much economic or finances that you have If we pair that with family size, that matters. If there's only one single parent in the household and they lose their job because of, again, losing the job is the economic frame, right? It's an external issue. But how it affects a small, single, one-parent family is very different from how that stressor impacts a two-parent, larger family. Does that make sense? So you always have to kind of think about these in together rather than separately. Also makes it easier to study when you can remember things together. So now let's look at kind of developmentally how families deal with stress as they go through the family aging process, as I like to call it. And so one of the things we have to remember is that young families experience vastly different stressors, and they also deal with those stressors differently because they do not yet have the experience to do so. Young families are usually, they lean very heavily on older families that went before them as an example, because they're so new to it. They kind of monkey see, monkey do to the best of their ability until they kind of find their own feet most of the time. One example of this is that we see in a lot of research that following the birth of a child, we see a decline in marital satisfaction. Partners tend to speak less to each other as a result. If they do speak, it's usually about the child, and the conversations that they used to have where they would share their own ideas and personal opinions and thoughts and feelings with one another tend to be reduced. And so because of that, we need a lot of what we call social support. And social support refers to this idea that others come in and help the family manage stress, right? Usually this is through the form of communication, either through nonverbal communication, like physically visiting someone, seeing how they are, checking up on them, all of that kind of stuff. It's also verbal, right? Giving messages of loyalty, reassurance, encouragement, sharing knowledge, all of that kind of stuff. Young parents, for example, will tend to reach out to other young parents and ask them about their experiences and what's going on with them so that they can all create this network of social support and kind of get through this stage. Then usually we get growing families. So these aren't young families anymore. These are definitely families that are a little bit more stable in the way that they allocate roles. They're a lot more stable in their self-concept as a family. And we usually get children that are a little bit more grown and mature, right? No longer infants. And so we get families then that have to deal with the development of these children, right? So instead of just being a baby that has different needs, now we're getting toddlers and young K through 12 children that need education and need support and extracurriculars and all these other concepts, right, that come along with that. And so this becomes a heavy form of stress on the parents, particularly at that preschool age where children really need to learn language skills, where parents need to set boundaries for them and socialize their kids. And so this becomes a huge source of stress for families because this is not an overnight undertaking, right? This is a long-term commitment to have a child. And this stage is particularly difficult because especially going into preschool, most children have always spent most of their days with their parents or their family. It can be very overwhelming for them to try to go to school and have this new experience with people that are basically strangers to them, right? But it has to happen and it has to be part of their socialization. And so the parents have to not only deal with their own stress and trying to logistically get all these things together, right? Registering them for school, packing them lunch, all that kind of stuff, but also managing the child's emotional and mental well-being and encouraging them throughout that process, right? Of course, some children love school and some don't. And so there are all varying degrees of that as well. And so what we do find, though, is that stress during this period is usually managed through topic avoidance, where family members try to just not talk about it and chug right through it. And I think to a certain extent that is because people are generally aware of the fact that this is a very normal type of stress, right? And this is something that will pass. They recognize most of the time that this is not a permanent type of stress, that ultimately their child will grow up, right? And not be so scared of school anymore or not have to learn boundaries anymore. So it's very important. And then we get growing families. Oh, excuse me for that. I do not know why that is in there. Un momento. But while I fix this, I don't know what happened there. while I fix this, growing families are always interesting to think about, because now we're kind of at the stage of a family that isn't young anymore, so they know what they're doing, right? They've set some good role allocation. They've gone through that growing phase where they've helped their child work through a lot of their own insecurities as far as going to school and getting socialized, learning boundaries, learning language, all these complex things. And now we get a little bit more of a focus on the couple themselves, right? So now I've taken that random YouTube video that just stuck out anywhere. And now we're kind of getting couples that are changing in their relationships. They're aging, they're retiring. Usually at this point, the children are adults and self-sufficient. And so we get couples that are able to retire and kind of learn new ways of being with each other, right? So all these years you've just been acting as a parent, and now that role of being a parent isn't super active in your life as much as it was before, because your children are no longer as dependent on you. So you, as a couple, have to renegotiate who you are, right? We also see a change in sibling relationships, right? Contact with each other changes. It might get reduced. It might actually skyrocket depending on where they are in their lives. Although we tend to see siblings place more importance on their relationship than they did as younger children. Of course, that's not the case for everybody. Some people grow apart from their siblings as well, right? And then we get what we call the sandwich generation. This is when we get middle-aged parents that have to take care of their parents, but also have to take care of their children at the same time. So they become what we call the sandwich generation. They're sandwiched right in the middle between it. And actually, a poll from Pew actually showed us that the millennial generation is the generation with the most responsibility for their parents. So in the past, what we would typically see in the context of America, I'm not talking about other countries, but in the context of America, what we would typically see is children grow up, they become more mature, they go to college or they get a job, and they become much more self-sufficient. And their parents, because their parents had retirement money or some sort of other funds set aside for retirement, the parents don't really depend on the children a lot. But that's actually not the case today. We find that the millennial generation actually has to spend a lot of their money and their time on their parents. Parents of millennials are actually much more likely to live with their children and actually need to live with their children for financial support. And so we find that sandwich generation is becoming more and more prominent as the years go by. So we actually end up with the millennial generation, a generation that is typically saddled with a lot of higher education debt, are working in an inflated economy, right, where they can't really buy a house or have the resources or social capital to do so, and they also have to take care of their parents. So stress is out there. If this is one of you, I feel you. I'm there for you. I get it, and it's becoming more and more of a trend as years go by. So what we typically see then is that in this type of family, instead of avoiding talking about stress, as we kind of saw in our previous stage of young families, what we see here now is that we get families that deal with stress verbally, but usually through kind of politeness, niceties, cliches, small talk. And an example of this is from the movie Inside Out. So I put that here, where you can see that the family has just moved to a new home. That's actually a huge stressor for any family, right? Kind of picking up your roots and physically going somewhere else. Usually that involves children changing schools and all these other kind of moving parts that have to get addressed and become stressors. And so here you can see that the two parents notice that their child is upset and stressed out. This causes them stress because no parent wants their child stressed out. And so you can see how they try to use niceties, small talk, things like, how is school? Do you like it? What's going on? As a way to try to address the stress that they know their child is going through. Again, with this thing is causing me stress, y'all. But that's okay. That's an external type of stress, and I know how to deal with it. I just know. All right. So, speaking of how to deal with it, let's talk about divorce. So, divorce is an interesting topic. I love talking about it. Not that I love divorce, but I love talking about it because I think it's such an interesting way of looking at how one decision can impact an entire system. And when I mean system, I mean the whole family. And so I know this is a lot, but I thought it would be beneficial to put it on one slide so it could be a little bit more clear. So I'm actually going to zoom in and kind of distill some of this down for you so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here, as far as dealing with divorce and the stress that it deals with. So let's talk about spouses first. How do the spouses deal with the divorce? Typically, what we see is custody of the children becomes the first, if not the number one stressor. And that becomes kind of the focal point of their conversation. Children become shuttled kind of back and forth, right? You become this glorified Uber, right? Where you have to Uber your child back and forth because of the shared custody. The effort to have to do that only reminds you constantly of the stressor, right? The stressor that you have to share custody. What we find is then that single parents usually have to deal with and take on the burden of that emotional, psychological, financial responsibilities. They kind of have to absorb all of the responsibilities of the family and become the family's rock. We typically see that the best way to help single parents with this, particularly single mothers, because they're typically seen as gender-wise, they're expected to be the primary caregivers for the children. So it's really important to, like I said in the last slide, pull those social systems in and support single parents by giving them senses of solidarity, showing them your concern, showing them your sympathy and your understanding. Children respond to the divorce differently. Typically, what we find is most children end up residing with their mother at the end of it. It's usually not the divorce per se that actually causes the adjustment issues. It's actually what the parents are going through that impacts the child. So all this kind of stuff up here on how the parents are going through a lot of turbulence, a lot of conflict emotionally, and mentally, that is actually what ends up being an issue for the children most of the time. There usually end up being a lot of mixed signals that the children have to figure out how to read. So sometimes children don't know how to manage their parents' divorce. Unfortunately, a lot of times parents make children the focal point of their divorce, where they kind of put the child in the middle of them per se, and then kind of make the child feel torn between these two worlds, right? And so because it's so relatively a new body of research, we don't actually see a lot of definitive, discussions on how children are impacted by divorce. Even your textbook admits, and I'll admit too, that sometimes researchers will say that there are permanent impacts on children when it comes to divorce, and others say that no, not really. So the court is still out on that one. Feel free, though, to put that in your journal and chime in and see what your experience is with that, right? Since we haven't really seen any research that can definitively tell us one way or the other. Although definitely, at least in the short term, it's can be very damaging and hurtful to children. So the consequences of divorce are what we're going to talk about now. And like I kind of brushed on before, we get that interparental conflict. Interparental conflict refers to between parents, how they fight, and usually children end up being the unintended victims of that, right? So parents might actually intend to hurt one another, but in that process, they end up hurting the children. Other life stress, right? For example, if the parents divorce and then the children have to move one way or the other, or one of the spouses have to move one way or the other, it ends up resulting in additional external stressors. We also get stressors from poor parental adjustment. So sometimes parents themselves can't adjust to suddenly being alone, right? Being the only parent in the household, or being the only adult in the household, right? And it's a difficult thing for them to adjust. And so while they're adjusting, oftentimes that means they can't really be helpful to their children as their children are trying to adjust as well. And so it's very difficult to try to manage those two impacts as well. And parent competence. And I'm going to say that this is the most important out of all of them, and I think your textbook and researchers would agree, that parent competence is the biggest factor in how children respond to and are affected by the stressor of divorce. If a parent or both parents are competent in their ability to work with one another, communicate positively with one another, and find ways to help their children adjust to the change, and also find ways for them themselves to adjust to the change in their lives, then that factor of parent competence really makes the biggest difference in whether or not children are negatively impacted by divorce. So now let's talk about other forms of unpredictable stress. I love that your book talks about homelessness. We have such an unseen homelessness crisis in California that I think it's so important to talk about. Oftentimes we see the person, right, the homeless person, and they are the results of a lot of long-standing struggles that they have had in their life, a lot of external issues that they have had to deal with. And we have to think critically as family scholars about not just the homeless person, but all of the context. Why are they homeless? What continues to make them homeless? What resources do they need to not be homeless if they so choose? All of that. And homeless families are out there. We would like to think that we're in America, we're in a first world country, right? That doesn't happen. It definitely does, especially here in California. And so I put a documentary here for you to watch so that you can see a real life example of what it looks like to be homeless in America. And the documentary also provides fantastic examples of these communication challenges. So the first one is maintaining privacy. When you're homeless and you don't have a home to go to, your family's out in the open. Any conflicts that happen in public, right? Anything that happens, any communication is in public, and it can be very difficult. Children tend to seek out what we call surrogate parents. So when they go to school, for example, they might latch themselves onto a teacher or a coach or a mentor or someone that they find to be a surrogate stable parent, because typically when you are homeless, that means that you are not capable of providing stability, right, to your child through no fault of your own, right? It's the external factor of being homeless that has that issue. And that usually comes with these next 3 bullet points: managing health and legal issues and stability issues, right? Health issues are very, very big, right? When you don't have a place to shower and kind of wash your clothes consistently and have a clean, safe place to sleep, that becomes a big factor in your health as well. Typically, if you're homeless, that also means you are in poverty and not able to go to the doctor and get checkups and medicine and access all of that. It also deals with managing legal issues. If you are homeless, for example, you don't have the social resources to understand what are your legal rights, how to fight for your legal rights, and there are actually a couple of examples in the documentary about legal issues where homeless families have to kind of rely on just their own internal knowledge to mitigate some of the impact of legal stressors that can come along with that. Even things like getting a license, right? Where if you don't have an address, what would be on your license? Things of that nature. And then stability as well, right? Shelters are not conducive to usually a mother-child relationship. Oftentimes I'll hear people who are not too familiar with homelessness say to me, well, why can't they just go to a shelter for the night? Why do they have to be out here on the street? And my answer is typically it's not that easy to get into a shelter. A lot of them have capacity limits, right? So that typically means that you have to be there bright and early in order to secure your spot. If you're trying to work or take your child to school or do other things, you can't always be at the shelter bright and early to secure yourself a spot. And also, even if you do make it into a shelter, it's not a safe place. It is typically full of other people who are also trying to survive. And whenever people are in situations where they have very limited resources, they get very competitive. Violence can occur as a result. And so it's not a safe place to raise children. Then we also get what we call public mothering, which is where, because there is no privacy, all the mothering has to happen between mother and child in public, right? This could be something like public breastfeeding. It can also mean something like public punishment, right? Kind of talking to your child, chastising your child in public, right? Something that you wouldn't do in public, but you have to because you are a homeless individual and you don't have that resource to be able to have a home to go home to and privately talk to your child or chastise your child or critique your child. Then we get unraveling. This is the assignment of parental roles to older children. I touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about other models, specifically the contextual model where we talked about external context. However, unraveling, we see that happen at an extreme rate in homeless families simply because when you are a parent that is the only parent providing for a multitude of children, and their needs, usually what that means is that older siblings have to take on a lot of that responsibility because no one person can really perform all of those responsibilities to their full extent, right? So that might mean siblings having to help younger siblings with homework, having to do their laundry for them, having to feed them and take care of them. And those are things that a mother sometimes has to pass on to older siblings to do when they're in these kind of more dire situations. Then we get guarding, right? Moms have to kind of make extra efforts to keep their children safe because they are in this more public situation because of their homelessness. And so I have a couple examples here also from Pursuit of Happiness where you can see here that in one clip, because he wasn't able to get a place at the shelter, he and his son have to sleep in a public restroom at the train station overnight. It is such a heart-wrenching moment in this movie, but I think it does a great job of pointing out the struggles of a single parent that is homeless, right, and what they have to work through. I do, however, 100% encourage you to watch this documentary. It's so short, it's so fascinating, it's so interesting. I know that a lot of you hear the word documentary and you're like, oh, I don't need more boring things in my life, Miss Lynn. And then I'll tell you, it will not bore you. I promise you. It is so relatable. Because it really just shows this mother and daughter trying to make it through just everyday tasks and the struggles of doing that, being homeless. And I think it really shows us, for those who are not homeless, a little bit about what that world is like. And I think it really helps you develop your empathy and critical thinking skills as well, which is what you're here to do in college, right? Learn different things that are different from what you know. So, with that being said, that is our chapter 8, and I hope this chapter did not cause you a lot of stress. I will say that I know a lot of these concepts are very, 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 very similar to each other. So if you need any more help or assistance or need more examples, that's what I'm here for. Every student learns differently, so don't feel like you're not capable or you're you're not intelligent if you're not getting the examples I'm giving here. Sometimes you might need different ones, and so I try to use generic examples in my video lectures. But if you need something different or you need to bring it down to your lived experience a little bit more, let me know. It's all about applying these models and theories to your life and your family so that this class can not only be for your college education, but also for your lifelong education as a person who is going to have to mitigate a lot of stress with their family. So that has been it. I am here if you need anything, and I will see you all next time. Bye.